Hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar. We're really pleased to have you with us today. My name is Lucy Double and I'm joined by my colleague Joe, who is here to provide technical support, as well as Jean and Roger, who will introduce themselves properly in a minute. I'd just like to start with a few bits of housekeeping. You will notice that we've muted your lines because we're expecting a high volume of participants on the call. However, we do want this to be interactive, so please do use the chat function. You will see this at the bottom right hand side of your screen. So if you can send your questions and comments to all participants, that would be great. Thanks very much. We are recording today's session and we'll be sending a link out to that as well as all the slides that you'll see today to you afterwards. Before I hand over to today's speakers, I would like to find out a bit more about you in a quick poll, if Joe could just open that up. Please could you click the Your Answers followed by Submit. We'll leave this open for a couple of minutes so you can all do that. And whilst you're doing that, I'll hand over to Jean and Roger to introduce themselves. Jean, Roger?
Yes, hello. So my name is Jean. I'm a member of faculty here at Ashridge, and I got intrigued by this subject many years ago when working at the Belgian university and tried to see how different the Dutch and the French are from the Belgians. That's where it all started. And then from then on, I've always worked internationally, and this is an area that I'm really interested in working with groups all over the world around. So that's me.
Hi, I'm Roger. I'm the head of the People and Leadership Faculty Director, and I'm the General Management Qualifications Portfolio Director here at Ashridge. This is an area that's fascinated me for a long time. I spend a lot of time working with very diverse groups of people in the classroom, and I got particularly interested in it when I lived in a country for 12 years that one wouldn't think of as being culturally particularly different to the UK. I lived in Ireland, and indeed I'm half Irish. But one of the things I discovered was that when you think about culture and different cultures, often organisations and indeed entire countries that look very similar can actually be very different. And I got fascinated by the whole area of cultural difference then. So that's us. I'm going to start by taking you through the agenda. But first, I want to encourage you to do the poll. So your poll is up, and you've got around about 3.5 minutes to do it still. So it's the poll question is, who do we have with us today, and what brings you here today? And it's really important to us that we get some feel for that. So do please fill that in for us. You've still got time to do it, and we do need the information.
Okay, I think we're just about there actually, so we'll just close the poll in just a second. So it looks like predominantly HR and L&D professionals, fantastic, and the reason that you're here today is overwhelmingly to further your learning on the topic, which is great because we've got two good experts here today. So thank you very much for that, everybody. And I will now hand back over to Roger, who's going to run you through the agenda, and then he and Jean will take you on for the next 50 minutes or so. So thank you, Roger.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. So, leading through culture, taking on a global mindset. What we've done is we've split the agenda into 4 sections, of which Jean is going to do the great bulk, but I'm going to start with section 1 and talk about, very briefly, what is a global mindset. Jean's going to talk about why are cultural differences and understanding them important in doing global business. And then in section 3, we'll look at what are the challenges in understanding cultural differences. And finally, wrapping it up and putting it together, the global mindset and global dexterity. Now, all the way through, we're interested in your thoughts, your questions, and your observations. But as Joe was saying earlier on, your microphone is muted, so use the chat box at the end on your page and keep on feeding through to us your questions, your thoughts, your observations, and Lucy will be looking at those. And as we get to the question section of the hour together, we will be picking up on your questions and your observations, and Jean and I will comment on them. What we're looking for in terms of an outcome, as we go on to the next slide, the outcome for this webinar will be to explore the mind and the skill sets needed to work effectively in a global world. More and more of us have to do this the entire time, so it's good that we understand what kind of a skill set we need for that, and to highlight the importance of understanding how different cultures work. It's something that we all pay lip service to, but do we really understand what this means? We're going to introduce some useful frameworks to deal with the differences, and we're going to talk about what are the effective skills in understanding the differences. So, like everything at Ashridge, it is grounded in some rigorous research, but it's also about some very practical and pragmatic skills that you'll be able to take away with you. So, straight away then, into section 1, what is a global mindset? Well, let's start with what it isn't. I don't think a global mindset is about being international. The world is full of international companies, and what they do is they simply export themselves internationally to different countries. They don't attempt to integrate or to embrace diversity. I worked for a long time with a very successful company. They happen to be from Germany, and wherever I went to visit them around the world to work with them, what I discovered in their offices was a little piece of Germany. And that meant that they were international, but they certainly weren't global. And because of this lack of a global mindset, they actually weren't leveraging their international presence anything like as much as they could or should have done. They were, if you like, missing an opportunity. And I don't think a global mindset is about having a strong organizational culture. I'm not saying a strong organizational culture isn't useful, of course it is, but the stronger your own culture, the more that culture can sometimes subsume and even stifle the diversity and cultural complexity that underpins a global mindset. Because if the organizational culture not only rewards but requires people to behave in an organizationally appropriate way, then their cultural diversity gets lost in this rewarded or required behavior. And many a multinational or global player does, almost without thinking about it, create these subsuming cultures, these overarching cultures that require people to behave in this organizationally appropriate way. They call it a global culture. But what it does is it destroys the global mindset, because it undermines the diversity that Jean's going to talk about that's at the heart of a global mindset. So what is a global mindset? It is this celebration of diversity. It's this allowing and encouraging different cultures to contribute to and enrich your own. It's about being other-centric rather than self-centered as an organization. It's about being dexterous. It's about embracing lots of other thinking and allowing that other thinking to color your organizational palette. So it's complicated and it's complex. And the man sitting on my left knows a great deal more about it than I do. So I'm going to hand over to Jean to talk about why is understanding cultural differences important.
Okay, so I think, thank you, Roger. I think first of all, it's not just an academic thing. It's also the thing that there are a lot of people who are interested in it. And I think that when we talk with people, we hear always on how important this is. And this slide just shows a little bit of a couple of quotes from different people, just saying it's not just an academic interest, but it's also important for the business. And I think the most important or the most fun one is, I think, the one by Thomas Stewart, which builds a little bit on what Roger says, that who says that a global manager is set apart by more than a warm suitcase and a dog-eared passport. So I think there is this illusion very often when I work with international managers that they say, Jean, we don't need this because we travel a lot and we see a lot of cultures. And that gives some people the illusion that therefore they're also effective in these cultures. Now, if I would use that analogy, then I would be extremely good at tennis, because I watch a lot of tennis games on television, but that doesn't make me all of a sudden very good at it. So I think sometimes people think because we are exposed to international travel and so on, we are good at working across boundaries and across cultures. That's one. The other thing is, I think a lot of people think that the world is flat, and therefore I think it's good now to have your opinion if yes or no the world is flat in this poll. So if you could...
I always think this is a trick question when you ask this.
Yeah. It is, that's why I ask it. So do we...
if all the participants would like to select yes or no as Jean's great question, the world is flat, we'd be interested in your views. If you could click away and submit on the right-hand side, that'd be great.
And there's a time limit of 1 minute, so you have to choose quickly. What we should do, Jean, is we should keep a poll of what the answer is from different parts around the world.
Yeah, that would be good, then we can see. Because I think there is... Do we have any results, yeah?
So we have a no.
No.
We have an overwhelming no.
Okay, that's good in terms of that it supports my opinion. I don't say it's therefore right, but I think the world is indeed flat, but it also has a lot of potholes still. This is a quote by Greg Barrett when he was CEO of Intel, and I think that's one of the important things. I think that for a lot of people, like most people on the call, we think that the world is flat because we travel a lot, we are in international hotels, we see everywhere the same things. And therefore, sometimes when I talk with international managers, they say, yeah, but we're all the same. But when, for instance, you're in India working with a group, which once happened to me, and we were in a hotel, and that hotel could have been anywhere in the world. But then when these people were doing projects in India, they really realized, oh my God, this is not like we were in the hotel where everybody looked the same, worked the same as we are used to. This is indeed very different. So I think very often we overestimate how flat the world is, but it's good to hear that you agree with me. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that culture is the most important factor in business, but very often I think it's the most ignored one, and therefore I think it's time to look at why is it then so important to understand it. Well, for me, there are three main reasons in working with international clients all over the world, is that more and more people get asked to collaborate across cultures. We have more and more international teams with the added complexity of virtuality, and then more people are leading other people who are not from their own culture, where expectations on leadership are important. And of course, everybody that you talk to say to me, Jean, but the diversity that we need in international teams gives us a lot of creativity, makes us understand our markets better, and so on. And what I do very often then, I take a picture of the management board of these companies. And this is what you get, yeah? And you can all see there's a lot of diversity. And very often these people have been with the company for many years, they've gone to the same school. You can see that the guy on the left is definitely responsible for Asia, and the guy on the right for Latin America. And what also always strikes me is this a good representation of the market you are serving? One of the clients I do a lot of work with is Electrolux. Now Electrolux is a group that makes products that gets used a lot by women, yeah? Not for us men on the phone call because we're all modern men in touch with our feminine side, but microwaves, washing machines and so on gets used much more by women than by men. And in the management board till around 15 years ago, there was not a single woman in the management board of Electrolux, nor was there not a single non-Swedish person, which was strange because at that time they had 100,000 people working all over the world for them and selling products all over the world. So the other reason, apart from the diversity, is of course, is this a good reflection of the market you are serving? But the reason why you find this so often is that it's easier, of course, to work with people who are like you. Imagine if we would recruit these two people in the organization. I know I've chosen extreme examples. One is Pink and the other one is Roger when he was young. But the thing is that what we have here is diversity being brought into the team. And the way this very often doesn't work, and that's why over the years, and this is an opinion, so you don't have to agree with me, I've become cynical about diversity programs in companies just for numbers, because sometimes we recruit people who are different. I know the pictures are very extreme, but when you talk to these people, they can only survive, or they tell me, we can only survive, Jean, if we start thinking like white men, so the picture above. So true diversity is really trying to get people to work with you who are actually different, and you appreciate them for the differences. But very often this is strange because we find it difficult, and therefore if we look at research about international teams, you can see that if you have a diverse team that is managed well, that the results are much higher than homogeneous teams. However, you can also see that when a diverse team is managed poorly, and there are more of them than managed well, then I think it's important to see that the results are lower than homogeneous teams. And I think that's one of the underlying unconscious reasons why people still choose for people to work who are like them in homogeneous teams, because the diverse teams take more time, take more effort, get you out of your comfort zone, and although it's an opportunity to learn, to get better results, sometimes these three obstacles that I just named take over, and therefore we don't get the best out of these teams. So that is one important thing, this collaboration, and on the other hand, the working in teams. Then the other one, which is an important one, is that leadership means something different. And this is a question which comes from one of the very first researchers on the subject, André Laurent from INSEAD, and he asked people in countries, is it important for your manager to have the precise answers? And you can see that people on the right would have an interesting view that the leader has supposed to be right and has to have the answers, where people on the left, it's much more, no, it's okay if a leader says, I don't know. Now, it is what it is, but of course, this leads to a lot of problems when you want to work with people from different cultures, or assume that you want to lead people from other cultures. Because if you are, I'm going to use an example that's very close to my heart, in Belgium, for instance, where you see it's more important that the boss has the right answer, so it's more hierarchical. If a Dutch person leads, for instance, a Belgian organization, he is always frustrated because he says, yeah, they always say yes to me because I'm the boss, but we don't know what they do. And the opposite, if a Belgian leads a Dutch organization, you get the effect of, oh, the Dutch, because in Holland they discuss with everybody and certainly with their bosses. So when a Belgian boss says something, you have all the Dutch people challenging it for the sake of challenging it. So when you're leading people from different cultures, this is a very important aspect to take in mind, that what people expect from their leaders might be different. The other area where this pops up quite a lot is in mergers and acquisitions. And to use Electrolux as an example again, the Swedish people at a certain moment with a very consultative management style, which fits this graph, acquired an Italian family-owned company called Zanussi. And you had this very interesting dynamic where the Italians were telling the Swedes, please tell us what we need to do, while the Swedes were asking, no, tell us what we need to do. And therefore, it got into an impasse where nothing moved until then the Swedish headquarters decided to try to solve this consultative and directive by implementing a matrix structure, which was very difficult to make work, because a matrix structure is as such difficult to make work, but is a concept that comes more from the countries on your left side. And I remember interviewing an Italian person who said to me, which fits very much also the picture here, he said to me, Jean, matrix structure doesn't work because you can't have two papas. And I think that's a good example of where, on the one hand, you could say this expertise model of leadership creates dependency. It also creates, of course, some elements of loyalty. But all these examples just show one thing, I think, and a French philosopher once said there are truths on this side of the Pyrenees which are falsehoods on the other, and I think that's one statement that everybody knows is true, but when we are in business we tend actually to forget this very, very quickly. Perhaps it's a good time now to see if there are any questions that pop up that might be worthwhile.
Well, we've had a couple of comments about global organisations being run by people who don't happen to be from a particular nationality, and are there any that work particularly well? So we've had an example of Electrolux that they had a very long-standing chief exec who was American, I believe, but now had lived in Sweden for a long time. So how does that work? Are there any sort of particularly good examples of that?
I think one of the things that you look for is not so much a particular nationality, but somebody moving into that kind of role who has already had a lot of diverse experiences themselves. So one of the things that I would often look for when I'm asking somebody about their experience is, okay, so maybe you're American, and oh, you've worked in India, that's interesting. Oh, you've worked for a Japanese company, that's interesting. Oh, well, you've worked in 2 or 3 different industries, that's interesting. Oh, you've worked in 2 or 3 different operational areas. You've worked in marketing and you've worked in finance, and you've had a general management role as well. So it's about rounding out experience, I think, and all of this diversity is multifaceted. It's your personal diversity, and that's about where you've worked, which kind of countries, which kind of cultures, with whom you've worked, which kind of roles you've taken, and so it's about being a rounded person in lots of different ways, and that's about the number of experiences. I get quite nervous when I see young people with limited experience being put in positions where they're being asked to manage people who've got far more rounded experience to call upon.
Okay. Yeah, I think, and the other interesting thing here is that a lot of research would say that it's also not just where have you lived, but what have you learned from the experience there. Because I remember when I was in HR, we had these expatriates, and then they were sent into certain countries. But when they came back, it's like they had always forgotten what they've learned. So it's not just having the experience, but building on what Roger said. It's also, did you learn and did that and therefore change some of your mindset?
Yeah, are you open to the experience? Yeah. I always think it's amusing when you look back at the great British colonial empire, and wherever the Brits went, they insisted on behaving as if they were still in the UK. And they wasted an awful lot of opportunities as a result.
Okay, any other question or...
Yeah, we've got one here that's saying, from a Japanese company's perspective, do you think that team members are afraid of challenging their managers? I don't know if you have any experience in that sort of area.
I would be loath to use the word afraid. I think what you do have in a number of different cultures, but particularly in Southeast Asia, you have a culture which says that challenging and being assertive is something which is not as welcomed as it is in other cultures. So one of the things that can quite often happen if you're from that kind of culture and you move into a different culture is that you realize that being assertive is something which is welcomed in some cultures and frowned on in other cultures. So if you're going to work in a diverse organization, you have to be prepared to go against your own cultural background and say, I know that in my own culture this might be frowned upon, but in this more diverse culture, I need to be more assertive because that's what's expected of me. And that's about understanding the difference between rewarded behavior in a diverse culture and rewarded behavior in a monoculture.
Great, thank you. Jean?
Yeah, I think it's good now, because I think it's also important in working across cultures. I just want to ask your opinion about what you think is the most important. And again, it's one of these questions where probably the 3 of them are important, but what you think is the most important.
Okay, so again, just your poll is on the bottom right-hand side, and it's moving pretty quickly, so thank you for that. Okay.
Gosh, that's a hard choice.
It's a really hard choice. So we're coming out with respect by quite a long way, actually, by about 50%. So yeah, that's looking like respect.
Okay. Yeah, and the reason why I asked this question is because a lot of people, they think if they have awareness and understanding, and that's why people like Roger and me get very often called into companies, can you increase the awareness and understanding of different cultures, which we can. But of course, the thing that we cannot teach, and that is the most important, is indeed that is respect, that different is not better or worse. And we all know that when we see people behaving differently, that makes us, first of all, suspicious. Second of all, that puts us into a judgmental mode because we have. I remember myself when I came to live in the UK, I didn't know actually that Belgium had a culture before I came to live in the UK, but I remember the first time I wanted to get on a bus in London, I wanted to do that the Belgian way, which is pushing people aside as much as you can to get in there. Now in London they do it differently, they stand in line, and that made me feel a little bit weird. Yeah, why do these people stand in line? But indeed, it is not just that now I understand where that comes from, it's also the respect that I can't be Belgian when I'm in London and want to get on that bus, because it is something very, very different. And the roadblocks that stops us actually from not only understanding but also showing respect are very often we tend to simplify, and simplify can go in different ways. Simplify can go in terms of, yeah, human beings are all the same and therefore you diminish the problem. Sometimes it's also more of a case of what we do is better than what the others do. I remember being on holiday once where with 50 Italians and 10 English people, where at a certain moment when people saw dolphins, the Italians stood up, started to shout Delfine, Delfine, and the English were very upset, or to use their exact words, quite upset when they saw that, because that was something that they were taught, certainly at lunch, not to do. And therefore we tend to think, which is very normal because we've been exposed to this for a long time, that the way we do things is of course the only thing, and that's where this ethnocentrism comes from. The other thing, of course, is when you talk about cultures, we all know, even a small country like Belgium has a lot of different cultures within the country. So it's not just the country, there's also companies who have different cultures, there's also professions who have different cultures. So you have to be careful that you don't fall into a generalization of this is typical Italian. It could be that it's typical Zanussi, it could be that it's typical accountant. So you have to be careful. And also with thinking typical, that leads into this thing that very often, because we judge and we like to put people in boxes, we very often stereotype. And I remember the English people on holiday saying, oh, that's typical Italian, and that's very dangerous. It's dangerous to stereotype, but it's even more dangerous, I think, if you forget that you are stereotyping. So because stereotyping is good fun, and we all do it making jokes, but we should never forget that a stereotype is only one part of the reality and not the whole reality. It's very often an exaggerated part of the reality. So if you look at the research that has been done on global mindset, I think this is an interesting one. This is Osland and Bird, who did a meta-analysis on all the papers written on what does a global leader do. And you can see it's quite a lot. And the global mindset is in the blue, is consisting of two things. We are only focusing today on what they would call cosmopolitanism, where it is about understanding different cultures. There's of course also a lot of cognitive complexity, but you can see that it is quite a lot that we expect from people to be successful in a global leadership or in a global management role. And as long as we are aware that this cultural difference understanding, or what they call cosmopolitanism, is only one, I think we're okay. I think very often also people tell me, yeah, if we know that, we're okay. No, it's to do with a lot of other things. And a couple of years ago, Andy Molinsky came up with this very user-friendly and also well-researched concept of global dexterity, which for me is a good way of thinking about what it's about. And it's about two things. First of all, do you understand the culture, which is about diagnosing cultural codes? And of course, it's not just about understanding, it's also about respect. And then it's about, do I, yes or no, customize to what the culture is different in? In that sense, do I adapt, yes or no, and how far do I go with adaptation? And then the third part, built on an answer that Roger gave earlier, is, do you integrate what you have learned? For instance, if I look at my personal example that I gave, now when I'm in Belgium and people are not standing in line, I get a little bit annoyed because I've been living and working here for 20 years, and therefore I think, oh my God, yeah, this is now the new normal for me. So do you integrate what you have learned? Because I think when you work with different cultures, there are two main challenges. One is, can I do what this culture, yes or no, expects from me? And the other one is what this culture is doing, is this really what I believe is the right thing to do? And therefore there are a couple of challenges that people have to deal with. One is, of course, if you are competent and if it fits what you have been learning, you're in your comfort zone. But sometimes you will have to do things that are outside of your authenticity, or things that you have learned that are not done. And I remember always working with a very international group, and there was a German manager, and we were talking about this, and I asked him about an example of an authenticity challenge. And he said, yeah, Jean, I work now in this factory in Brazil, and it's obvious that in Brazil, whenever you come in the morning, what you tend to do is you say hello by kissing. And it's not a competence challenge because Germans know how to kiss, but it was for him something that he wouldn't see that at work you would come in and start to kiss everybody. So that's a good example of an authenticity challenge. Sometimes it is the two. If I look at my own experience, I also teach at a business school in Hong Kong, and I do every year a session for government officials of China. And that's for me a double challenge. Why? First of all, the method of learning is very different. So it is showing slides and telling everything that you know, which is not something that I'm very competent in. But it's also an authenticity challenge because I have been brought up in a mindset that that is not exactly how people learn best. So when I do these 2 days, and that's one of the reasons why I do them, it's really a double challenge. I have to do something that I'm not really sure if it's the right thing for people to learn, an authenticity challenge, but also, which, because I hardly ever do it like that, is for me also quite a competence challenge. And I think while I'm talking about it, you probably all can come up with some examples of where you have been in different places where this challenges pop up for you in one or another way. Now, the other thing, which we're not going to spend a lot of time on, but I think it's important because if you look at understanding culture, or as Andy Molinsky would call it, diagnosing the cultural code, well, it's really a jungle out there, and sometimes you can lose a lot of time by reading academic papers where all these people comment on each other on how good or how bad the research is. And some of them come up with very different dimensions, some of them come up with very similar dimensions. What for me is more important is what all of these, as long as they are grounded, and the ones that I've put there are all grounded, is important, which is useful for managers. So the interesting thing here is that whatever model you use, it will help you only with understanding where a culture is different from yours. But it won't give you the answer, yes or no, do I have to adapt? Because that's your own choice, and yes or no, do I respect, which is also your choice. So it's not because you know. If I look at one of the dimensions that is very popular from Hall, high context versus low context, where high context is saying things in a way that the message is embedded in how you say it, so in the context, where low context is it's just in the words. Now, if that helps you to understand why when a Dutch person sends an email who is very low context to a Mexican person who is very high context, there might be misunderstandings. If that dimension helps you to understand, I think that's good. But that doesn't give you the answer, what do I do with it and how do I work with it, where a lot of the first work in working across cultures is indeed mapping these differences, and any of these models that are mentioned here could help you with that to increase your awareness and understanding, and hopefully by talking about it also your respect. Now, sometimes people ask me a very practical question, and that's probably the last, so we can spend quite a lot of time with questions, is when you have to put a team together, Jean, what would you advise is the best team? Well, I think British police, French cooks, Swiss bankers, German engineers, Italian lovers, and the Irish to organize the fun is probably still a heavenly team. However, if you would use German police, British cooks, Italian bankers, French engineers, Swiss lovers, and the Dutch to organize the fun, that probably would create quite some hell. Now, I don't know if there are any Swiss people in the call, but I remember last week I showed this to a group. There was a Swiss person, a Swiss man actually, and everybody looked at him when I showed that slide, and the only response he could give me was, yeah, but I'm partly Italian. So that was his excuse of fitting into the two heaven and hell team. So these are some of my thoughts on a very general level with a couple of personal examples, but please let's hear some of your questions here.
I think the Irish attitude is the best fun you can have is making love, so they combine the last two.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both for that input. Please do share your questions. We've been having a few technical issues, so some people are struggling to share with all participants. So if you can share with the host, that would be great, and Joe can share them. Jean, Roger, we have a question here. If we want to get the balance correct between the culture of an organisation you're trying to create and the respect and involvement of different cultures, how could we go about doing that?
Well, I think the critical thing is to make sure that the culture you're trying to create within your organisation doesn't disrespect any of the cultures that are part of that organisation. So I often get this when I'm working with a class which is multicultural, and I'll say to people in the class, you have to take a view that says, am I going to be disrespected by something when somebody asks a challenging question? Or am I going to take the position that says, this is not meant to be disrespectful because in the framework within which we're working, all of us are trying to collaborate together towards understanding something better. Now, in the organisational framework, I think you could reframe that to say, am I going to be disrespected by something where clearly each of us are trying to collaborate together towards the objectives of the organisation? So, for example, if you are doing something that requires you to work during what would be prayers, and you would normally be observant for prayers, you can choose to be offended by that and say, hang on a minute, or you can choose to say, this is not meant offensively, I can say my prayers at another time. Or you can choose to say, would anybody mind if we interrupted this briefly for 10 minutes whilst I said my prayers? But the point is, if it is not meant disrespectfully, there is a way to take it and work with it so that you are not offended. Equally, that is about being assertive but cooperative. You can be assertive and uncooperative and say, now just a minute, before we do anything about this, let me say how disrespected I feel, and then suddenly you have an issue. So a lot of it is about the intent and how people respond to that intent.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that, indeed, it's also true, and that's why this respect is so important. I think, and I know that somebody asked me a question about, or asked us a question about working with Japanese people. Well, I don't think that there's any Japanese person who expects you to get all the details of a Japanese culture. But the thing is, as soon, and that is not just true for Japanese, but as soon as somebody feels you're not respecting the culture, they become all of a sudden much more their own culture. So as long as you show respect, I think people will allow you to make mistakes. But if you already start by not showing respect, then people become even more closer to what is close to them, their culture, and become even more strict on some of their cultural habits and rituals.
And there's been a comment here as well about the effect that the vision and values of a company can have to support that sort of cultural diversity and how that can work, and perhaps how that can be supported by having a balanced management team. I don't know if you have any views on.
Yeah, but I think it goes back to something that I said. A balanced management team is you have to use them for the balance you have. I mean, it's not just, I've become over the years very cynical, based on some research also I did for ExxonMobil, because one of their burning platforms, although they hate that word, is diversity. And I interviewed a couple of people in Latin America and some colleagues in Asia, and all of these people, they said to me, Jean, yeah, we get promoted because, okay, I remember a female CFO in Mexico, but they said, but if I really want to get things done, I really started to think like a white male engineer from Texas, which was at that time mixed of the DNA of ExxonMobil. So balance is okay, but you have to use the balance for the differences, not that you get people there just because they are different and then they have to adapt to the common denominator.
Yeah, there's a difference between quota filling and being balanced. You can have a balance by having a mix of ethnicity, a mix of cultures, a mix of genders, a mix of ages, and you can still have a very unbalanced team because they all share the same attitude. Or you can have a team which might be very unbalanced in other ways, but because they have a very diverse set of attitudes, they are actually a very balanced team. So there's lots of different ways of looking at and thinking about balance. For me, I think that rather than looking at quota, we should look at attitudes and look at diversity as an attitude of mind rather than anything else. And I think one of the reasons why I think this is because more and more we look at people who have such a cultural mix in their background, maybe because they have parents from a particular ethnicity or cultural background and they themselves have been brought up in another country, for example, that it's more about attitude than just looking at ethnicity or skin color or whatever it might be.
And it's interesting there, Rod, that you mentioned skin colour, because there is a question here about unseen cultural differences. When there is visual difference or an auditory difference, we become more aware about difference and can adjust to it. What about thought differences that are hidden when all else may seem similar?
No, I agree. And I mean, I had, from very early on in my life, I was exploring this because I happened to be brought up in the UK as a Catholic, which is a minority faith, but I didn't realise that when I went to senior school until in my first morning in senior school, the form master said, right, everybody stand to go to assembly. And we all stood up and he said, not you, Delves. And I went, why not? He said, Catholics don't go to assembly. And it was the first time I'd realised that not everybody was Catholic, even. And that is exactly that. It was an unseen difference. We all looked, I mean, this was back in the 60s, everybody looked the same. We were all little white boys going to school at the age of 11. But there was an unseen difference in that I was the Catholic boy in the form. And that unseen difference, as I explored it growing up, was actually a very significant difference because I had very significantly different attitudes to things brought up in that faith until I abandoned it in my mid-teens, to the boys who were brought up in the predominant faith, which was the C of E faith. So I have a lot of sympathy with that unseen difference thing. And I think that it can be very, very powerful. And it's one of the reasons why this kind of, the importance of these cultural things is vast, because you can sit alongside somebody who, to all intents and purposes, is the same as you, but in fact there is a vast gulf of difference between you because of this kind of unseen cultural difference.
Yeah, and I think when you discover the difference, then the same things apply. You tend to look at us versus them, you look at stereotypes. You sometimes see that with a monocultural group and they do an instrument like Myers-Briggs, and very quickly you get the same things as between cultures, that the extroverts think this about the introverts and the introverts think that about the extroverts. So I think once they got out of the open, these hidden, I think it is indeed the same principles apply. The other thing is, of course, that I think what is needed is not get blurred by these big differences, but sometimes also very small differences that can have a huge influence on how you do business. And that goes back to hidden differences. Even, I mean, a lot of people, they say Americans, but in America there's so many cultural differences. Unfortunately, they're not well studied, but there are a lot. But if you would look at, okay, they all look the same, if they are white male Americans, but they might be very different in where they come from. So going a little bit deeper is, I think, another invitation that I would say to be successful is try to understand a little bit what goes underneath the things that you can see.
Great, thank you. I think that brings us to the end of our questions. So I just wondered if you had any more closing comments or thoughts that you wanted to leave us with.
I think, from my perspective, this is an area that can't be ignored, and equally will never be something that can be fully understood because it's changing the whole time. So I go back to something we were talking about earlier on, and I think in terms of a global mindset, I think if you go in with a positive attitude that says, if we're going to work in a global environment, then I am going to have a positive attitude towards embracing diversity. I'm going to have a positive attitude towards looking for common ground rather than looking for areas where there are differences and dissimilarities. Then as a leader, I can bring my team with me. I loved what Jean was looking at and where he was looking at this thing about being competent and authentic. If I can keep my authenticity and get people into areas where we are together competent, then we get this combination of lots of people from lots of diverse backgrounds working together, and then the whole truly is greater than the sum of the parts.
Okay. Yeah, I think these final thoughts, I think whatever model you use, and I showed you the jungle, they are indeed a good place to start to understand the cultural differences, but it is only a starting point, and it's by interacting with people that you get to know them, and you might see how, yes or no, they fit the dimension, how it is described by any of these models. I think very often we tend to put a lot of emphasis on what is different, but I always think that it's better to look at what do we have in common. I always use the example of Harley-Davidson groups. Harley-Davidson groups, if you go to a Harley-Davidson gathering, you're going to find a very big diversity of people. Yeah, you're going to find professors, you're going to find managers, workers, doctors, nurses, whatever. Why do they get along very well? Well, they focus on the one thing that they have in common, that is the love for the Harley-Davidson. So I think very often we focus so much on these differences that we forget to find something that we have in common. And then by being aware, understanding, and respect, you can make it work. I always just cannot say it enough, be careful with stereotypes. And also, I know that at the end of a webinar like that, you have to have at least 2 difficult words that you can impress your friends with later today. Well, it's cultural relativism. What I mean by that is, it goes back to a group that I was once working with where I asked them to talk about their culture. And these were Italians, Swedes, and Germans. And then I also asked them to comment on each other. And I remember the Italians saying about the Swedes, we think that the Swedes are very structured. Towards the Germans looked at me and said, the Swedes structured. So it is very important to realize that how you see the other is very dependent and relative to where you start yourself. And an ecological fallacy is that what a lot of people make a mistake is they see a dimension of entrepreneurs, for instance, are people showing a lot of emotion, not a lot of emotion at work, and they think then that the next individual, for instance, Italian, who is used to show a lot of emotion, is going to live up to that dimension. And that is the problem, that these dimensions don't give you the right to take decisions about individuals, and that is called ecological fallacy. So I hope we shared some of our thoughts based mainly on our experience personally and working with other groups. But if you have any questions afterwards, you have our email addresses and you can always contact us. Yeah.
And I think we have one final question that's just come in, actually. I think, Jean, you're talking about tools and models that you can use has triggered it. And is there one that you could recommend to evaluate the cultural differences of a business area within a firm?
Yeah, I think there is a recent one by a colleague at INSEAD, Erin Meyer, and that is culture maps. Because what she has done, it's very recent. She has looked at some of the dimensions coming from some of these other providers. And the good thing is at the moment it's still free, you can go, if you just Google her, Erin Meyer, you can go on a Harvard Business Review website, you can fill in the questionnaire and you can compare yourself on her dimensions with other cultures. And I think the reason why it's good, it's grounded, but it's also a good summary of the most dimensions that all the other schools of thought have come up with.
Great, thank you very much. So Jean, Roger, thank you very much for your input. We are interested in your feedback and looking at ways that we can improve these sessions, so we're just going to put a quick poll up on the screen. We'd be really grateful if you could spare a couple of minutes to fill this in for us. You should see it on your screen in just a second. We will also send you out the links to the slides and the recording over the next couple of days, so you can review that and share with colleagues. So yes, thanks again, Jean, Roger, and thank you to you as an audience for sharing your questions. And for all the insights we've heard. So thank you very much. And the poll will be up on the screen for the next couple of minutes. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.